This module for the Impacts Project through Youngstown State University is focused on motivational interviewing, including an overview and techniques for promoting change. This project is supported by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In Part 1, we'll focus on MI basics. Before we get started in focusing on the basics, it's important to understand why motivational interviewing is a technique that's considered evidence-based and how to go about using these techniques in a way that supports clients in considering change. The reasons why motivational interviewing works are supported by research. First, we know that depending on how a person talks about change, he or she can become more or less inclined to see a need to make changes. For example, if I am trying to encourage my client to make changes and I argue for the change, it's likely that in the client's head, he or she is going to counter my arguments with reasons against change. When clients are ambivalent about change, it means that they have good reasons both for and against change at the same time. This ambivalence can be difficult to overcome. The reason motivational interviewing is effective is because it creates space for the client to resolve this ambivalence. As was stated previously, being told what to do or what not to do forces us into a position where we argue for the other side of the argument. Through using motivational interviewing to have collaborative conversations, we take away this natural instinct to argue the other side and allow the client to argue his or her reasons for change for him or herself. As an example, if I were to tell you that you have to go to the gym, or to save money, or postpone your vacation, chances are automatically in your head you're both consciously and unconsciously trying to defend the other side of this argument. This happens out loud and in our self-talk, so we may never hear it from our clients, but it happens nonetheless. So that's the why of motivational interviewing. What about the how? By engaging in communication techniques that allow the client to discuss thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and values, and then connecting these to his or her stated goals, the person argues for change rather than against it. Engaging clients in these kinds of conversation helps them to work through ambivalence, to feel validated, and to connect values and goals with their own personal choices and actions. It's important to note that the client's goal, and not the goal that we think they should have, is important to stay focused on when using motivational interviewing. Because the client is more likely to work towards goals that he or she finds personally valuable, our goals should not ever supersede or replace the goals the clients have. Motivational interviewing is grounded in the stages of change, which is a model for conceptualizing how people move through the change process. There are 5 stages within the stages of change, and clients can enter and circulate through these at any point in the continuum. Pre-contemplation is when an individual is unaware that change is needed and doesn't acknowledge that problems exist at all. Contemplation is when clients are aware that change might be helpful, but they see both pros and cons of change and are experiencing ambivalence around whether change is needed. Preparation is when clients are not only aware that change might be helpful, but they also begin to make plans for changes that they might enact. Action is when the client is consistently enacting changes, refining changes when it's appropriate, and reflecting on the impact of the changes and their progress toward their goal. Finally, maintenance is when changes that were made previously are now part of a lifestyle and not something the client is actively thinking about and monitoring on a consistent, attentive basis. In addition, there is the relapse and recycle stage, during which a client may return to previous behaviors. When this happens, clients can return to any previous stage of change depending on their experience in the relapse and recycle. It's not likely that the client will go from relapse and recycle back to pre-contemplation. However, the potential for them returning to contemplation or preparation exists. As an example of what this might look like in clients, pre-contemplation would be when a client comes to you without acknowledging that they need treatment or need services and that everything is just fine. Contemplation is where they acknowledge that something may not be working so well for them, but they really aren't sure whether it's worth doing something about. Preparation is where the client can say, yes, it's worth doing something about, and I'm thinking about maybe doing something. Here are the things I'm considering. An action is when the client is stating not only their plans, but enacting them consistently in order to keep whatever it is that brought them into treatment from happening again. Maintenance is when you're working with a client and the changes that they've made are consistently a part of their lifestyle. When we're thinking about substance use treatment, these can include regularly attending AA meetings, maintaining long-term sobriety, engaging in practices that are supportive of ongoing recovery. There are 4 processes of motivational interviewing that help facilitate conversations about change. These processes occur throughout the conversations about change and are not linear, but like the stages of change, are also cyclical. Engaging is where you as the counselor are developing rapport with the client and encouraging an honest dialogue without judgment on your part. Depending on where clients are in the stages of change, you may be in the engaging process for a while as the client assesses whether or not you're someone that he or she can trust and whether you are on his or her side in terms of setting and achieving goals. Focusing occurs when the counselor helps the client identify areas of ambivalence and/or areas where change might be helpful based upon the client's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. This is where developing discrepancies, identifying not so good things that have happened because of the client's substance use, and assessing client strengths and values to help identify areas where the client can live more consistently aligned with his or her values can be valuable. Evoking occurs when the counselor promotes the client's reasons for making changes. This is where the client argues for change him or herself based on the way that the counselor chooses to use his or her words, questions, reflections, etc. Planning occurs when the counselor and the client collaborate to identify a way that changes might be made, to explore the confidence of the client in making these changes, and to help the client set goals and troubleshoot these plans. In all of these processes, the client is the leader in terms of identifying goals, considering options, and valuing what's important related to changes that need to be made. The counselor is a shepherd along the path, such that the counselor leads the client by staying half a step ahead of the client in terms of thinking about how to structure the conversation so the focus is on talking about change. There are processes that the counselor uses in order to accomplish these 4 processes of MI. The first and most important is expressing empathy for the client. Using affirmations and reflections to express empathy can be really helpful in supporting the client and feeling like the counseling space is a safe place to identify goals and opportunities for change. It's also important that the counselor takes a collaborative stance versus an expert stance. Specific advice on how to provide clients with feedback and information is going to be presented in the second part of this module. It's important also that the client remains the expert on his or her thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and choices, and that the counselor makes it clear that he or she is a partner in the client's process of change. It's important when counselors are working with clients, particularly clients seeking services for substance use, that the empathy is genuine. If the empathy isn't genuine, clients, first of all, are not going to feel safe in the counseling relationship. And second of all, they're not going to trust the process and open up to the possibility of making change. The second process involved in motivational interviewing is supporting client self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that if a client wanted to do something, he or she could successfully accomplish it. In order to do this, the client should be empowered to explore personal motivation for change. Client-centered discussion should encourage the client to articulate reasons for change, plans for change, and how to enact the plan. As a counselor, using affirmations and reflections can help promote self-efficacy, as can highlighting the client's strengths, previous efforts at change that have been successful, and reflecting client values and their congruence to the client's goals. The next process for motivational interviewing is rolling with resistance. It's important when working with clients who are in various stages of change to resist the urge to fix, give directives, should the client, or criticize client-generated ideas. It's important to continue to express empathy, particularly when the client is unwilling or unable to identify the need or plan for change. Using affirmations, reflections, and open-ended questions can help further explore client thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around reasons for maintaining the status quo, and can be more non-threatening than some more direct confrontational techniques. In all cases, rolling with resistance strongly encourages keeping the client talking so that he or she can continue thinking through their ambivalence for change. I like to frame resistance as self-protection, such that when we think about what the client is doing that's causing him or her to be resistant, if we take out the term resistant and put in the term self-protective, we can consider what the client is doing to protect him or herself and what we might be doing to cause the client to feel unsafe. By thinking about resistance through the lens of self-protection, we can have more empathy for the client, and also we can reflect on our role in the interaction and what we might do to course correct so that the client feels safer in the counseling conversation and in considering reasons for change. Conversation components include developing discrepancies that are relevant to the client. This is really the heart of MI that makes it different from some other kinds of person-centered counseling. This is also, through the counselor's choice of which discrepancies to develop, what makes MI directive rather than a purely person-centered technique. When developing discrepancies, it's important to reflect conflicting ideas with "and" rather than the word "but," because the word "but" typically causes us to pause and brace ourselves for the not so good thing that you're about to say. By putting two ideas together with the word "and," it smooths that transition and allows the client to consider both sides of the coin, so to speak. An example of this would be, on the one hand, I hear you say that you don't care about school, and on the other hand, it seems like learning is really important to you. Another way to develop discrepancies is to explore discrepancies between values and choices. Values oftentimes are strongly held and provocative for individuals, whereas choices that conflict with the values can demonstrate the ambivalence for clients. As an example, you might say something like, "You said it's important that others can count on you, and sometimes you are unreliable in completing your homework. I wonder how these two things go together for you." And again, the client is the expert on his or her thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. Your observation should only be provided after setting the stage to share them. One way to do this might be to ask the client, "Do you mind if I let you know something I've noticed? Let me know how this fits for you." Next, we'll transition to part 2, MI techniques.